March 2003. American mechanized forces sliced through Iraq, racing over 300 miles in 15 days to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein. May 1940. Hitler unleashes his panzers in a similar blitzkrieg against the Allies in Western Europe. Blitzkrieg is German for lightning war. In Operation Iraqi Freedom, U.S. forces went further, faster, and more effectively than ever before. The battle plan is Blitzkrieg. March 2003. American tanks race up the western flank of Iraq. The move is totally unexpected. The Iraqis think the main attack is to the east. Just a week before, this campaign was merely a plan on paper. But the coalition battle planners had very little doubt about its outcome, and none whatever about how it would be conducted.
This will be a campaign unlike any other in history. A campaign characterized by shock, by surprise, by flexibility, by the employment of precise munitions on a scale never before seen, and by the application of overwhelming force.
General Tommy Franks is Supreme Commander of the coalition forces in Iraqi freedom. His battle plan incorporates the most modern military thinking. But it's based on methods pioneered by men like Germany's Heinz Guderian almost 60 years earlier. Not surprisingly, because both men faced very similar challenges. In 1940, the Germans are poised to invade France. But their battle planners have a problem. Their forces are outnumbered. British and French forces are positioned in northern France along the Belgian border. The Maginot Line to the south is impenetrable. The Ardennes between is considered impassable. How can they break through to Paris and knock the Allies out of the war? In 2003, Tommy Franks and the coalition planners are in a similar predicament. Their forces are vastly outnumbered. They're unsure of the strength, position, and loyalty of Saddam Hussein's army. How can they push 350 miles north through Iraq and seize Baghdad? In both cases, the solution is the same. Call it shock and awe or call it lightning war. The battle plan is Blitzkrieg. Even though they are 60 years apart, the two battle plans for Blitzkrieg are based on the same essential formula. Deceive the enemy by attacking where he least expects. Control the air so that you can move freely while the enemy cannot. Break through by concentrating overwhelming force on narrow sectors. Strike deep with fast-moving units which move around enemy strongpoints and throw his forces off balance. Follow up with a mass army to eliminate the strongpoints and establish control.
The mind of the attacking commander must be as fast-moving as his forces. On the other hand, it helps greatly if the defending forces are confused and mesmerized by the speed with which the attackers attack.
Yet the very speed of the Blitzkrieg battle plan means that it has two major weaknesses. Counterattack. The main attack force is moving so rapidly that it becomes vulnerable to an enemy counterattack, which would cut it off from its backup. Logistics. Its resupply column has difficulty keeping up and becomes dangerously stretched and vulnerable to attack. And because to maintain its speed, the main attack force often bypasses local opposition, these points remain a threat to resupply and communication systems.
The weaknesses of Blitzkrieg really come from its strengths. If you're moving fast and you're moving far, then you are going to find that your flanks are open and also that you may very possibly overextend yourself.
In both France in 1940 and Iraq in 2003, the commanders had one overriding aim: to defeat the enemy with the least amount of face-to-face combat.
Blitzkrieg is an art of fighting war in which the aim is to do as little fighting as possible. It's to overwhelm, to psych out the enemy, and this has been a fundamental in Blitzkrieg throughout the centuries.
Every great commander is an avid student of history. Heinz Guderian and Tommy Franks are no exception. They both know that unleashing fast-moving forces into the enemy heartland is as old as warfare itself.
You can see the beginnings of the Blitzkrieg in the campaigns of Genghis Khan, the campaigns of Napoleon, and in the closing campaigns of the American Civil War. The essential thing is having a mobility advantage over your enemy, even when your forces are moving by muscle power, by means of horses and of men on foot.
But by the early 20th century, the speed needed to achieve lightning war has run up against formidable obstacles. Railways mean that the defenders' forces can now move faster than the attackers, and machine guns and rapid-fire artillery slaughter troops caught in the open. During World War I, this leads to the stalemate in the trenches. Millions of men die in futile attacks, while their commanders try to work out how to break through the enemy's line. The solution is the tank, which is first used by the British in autumn 1916. But early tanks are too slow and unreliable to exploit the gaps they can create.
By the end of World War I, the tank had made it possible for Allied forces to create gaps in the enemy line, but it was yet at a point where it could exploit those gaps.
During the 1920s, much faster tanks are developed by the British and Americans, and military theorists begin to plan how these might be used for a Blitzkrieg-style battle plan. During the 1930s, the German army in particular takes up these ideas. Commanders like Heinz Guderian begin experimenting with ways in which tanks, supported by aircraft and directed by radio, could win a lightning war. In a speech in 1935, Hitler makes the first open reference to Blitzkrieg. "I wouldn't make lengthy preparations," he says, "but suddenly, like a bolt of lightning in the night, hurl myself against the enemy." This battle plan is first tested in September 1939, during the Nazi invasion of Poland. Against a much weaker opponent, who could only throw cavalry against their panzers, the Germans were triumphantly successful. In spite of their vast technological and strategic advantages, there were still problems.
They found that some of their tanks broke down quite quickly. They found that fuel consumption far outstripped that they were expecting. They also found that the Luftwaffe weren't properly supporting the armoured spearheads as they were moving quickly. They needed to get those things right, to learn the lessons incredibly quickly before they took on the French and the British in France in the spring of 1940.
More than 60 years later, coalition troops would confront many similar setbacks, due once again to the challenges inherent in the Blitzkrieg battle plan. Spring 1940, the Germans are preparing to strike in the West. Their aim is to knock France out of the war by capturing her capital, Paris. But Paris is over 200 miles away, and Allied forces outnumber them. 149 divisions against 136, and 3,500 tanks against 2,570. Only in the air do they have overwhelming force. Over 1,700 bombers against less than 400, and 1,000 fighters against 830. But the Germans are confident that using the new Blitzkrieg battle plan, they can solve this. The first requirement of the battle plan for Blitzkrieg is to deceive the enemy. At first, the German planners envisage a rerun of their attack in 1914, a massive right hook through Belgium to outflank the Allied defenses. The Allies expect this too, and plan to swing forward into Belgium as soon as the Germans strike. On May 10th, they do. German troops cross the Dutch border. Elite glider-borne troops neutralize the key Belgian fort of Eben Emael. Hitler's Army Group B ignores Belgian neutrality as it did in 1914 and sweeps into the Low Countries. The British and French immediately start their planned move forward into Belgium. But the assault they are racing to meet is not Blitzkrieg. It's an attack, but it's also a deception. The Germans have revised their battle plan. The real attack, Blitzkrieg, will be here. The seemingly impassable hills and forests of the virtually unguarded Ardennes. 70% of Germany's panzers are here with Army Group A. Only 30% are further north with Army Group B, where the Allies think the main thrust will be. Over 60 years later, Tommy Franks and his planners face an apparently even more challenging situation. The first problem is distance. Baghdad lies 350 miles north of Kuwait, the start point for Iraqi freedom. The second is topography. Iraq is dominated by two major rivers, the Euphrates to the west and the Tigris to the east. Where these come together about 100 miles from the sea, there is an area of marshland. This is impassable to tanks. This topography and the road system creates what the military call choke points, places like river crossings, towards which advancing forces are inevitably funneled, and where they can be attacked from prepared positions. The Americans know this, but so do the Iraqis, and on paper at least, the figures seem to be on their side. Despite more than a decade of UN sanctions, Iraq still has an apparently formidable army of 375,000 men with more than 2,000 tanks. And Saddam Hussein can also call on a substantial number of irregulars, both dedicated followers of his Ba'ath Party and the Fedayeen, Muslim fanatics from all over the Arab world who have flocked to Iraq to fight the infidel crusaders. To get around this, Tommy Franks, just like the German planners 60 years before, allows his enemy and many Western journalists and military commentators to think that he is going for a completely different plan. Fresh in their minds is Operation Desert Storm, the war mounted just a decade earlier against Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. After an air campaign lasting 6 weeks and a land campaign of just 4 days, Saddam's forces were pushed out of Kuwait. Because of the distance to the main objective, Baghdad, Iraqi planners and many Western military pundits expect Franks to follow the same battle plan as Desert Storm. A prolonged aerial campaign before a land assault. And his staff do everything to encourage this.
In time-honored fashion, prior to the launching of Operation Iraqi Freedom, certain information, certain parts of the plan was actually leaked to certain individuals and organisations in the hope, and indeed the expectation, that it would get back to the Iraqi High Command and they would begin to plan on the pretext of that false information that they had actually received.
Also, Franks had originally intended to mount a second assault into northern Iraq from Turkey. The U.S. 4th Mechanized Infantry Division had been sent there by sea. But local opposition forces Turkey's government to refuse permission for the 4th Infantry to cross the country. the U.S. ships are reloaded and set sail for the Suez Canal and Kuwait.
Although deception plans have to be very carefully planned and programmed, there is of course always the opportunity to use events as they unfold to bamboozle the enemy. And a very good example of that is of course the coalition trying to move through Turkey.
Most commentators, and almost certainly the Iraqi planners, expect Franks to wait for the 4th Infantry to arrive before he attacks. This is exactly what he wants them to believe, but it isn't what he plans to do.
This is a very good example of how armies can use an unexpected opportunity to deceive the enemy. Because whilst the Iraqis are actually thinking that the Americans would have to come south and to relocate and reorganise themselves prior to the attack taking place in the south, all of the time the Allies are moving lighter troops to try and actually give them the edge that they need to launch an attack before the Iraqis can possibly think that they are ready.
So, on the brink of battle, both groups of battle planners have successfully fulfilled the first requirement of Blitzkrieg: to deceive the enemy as to their intentions. In May 1940, the Allies are totally expecting an attack into the Low Countries and have based all their battle plans on this. They do not even consider the possibility of an attack through the Ardennes. In March 2003, the Iraqis and many Western commentators are totally expecting a lengthy air campaign, while coalition forces are built up steadily to achieve overwhelming numerical superiority over the Iraqis. Then, a massive invasion was anticipated, not a surgical strike. The second requirement for a successful Blitzkrieg battle plan is to control the air. In 1940 and 2003, both the German and American battle planners have a clear advantage. They dominate the skies. In May 1940, the German Luftwaffe was a formidable force, with more than 1,700 bombers against less than 400, and 1,000 modern fighters against just over 800 for the French and British. The Luftwaffe had been built up from scratch in less than 5 years, and no expense had been spared. All its equipment was new. Its pilots elite. It had been designed specifically to support the sort of Blitzkrieg battle plan which Germany's leaders were intending to fight. In contrast, both the French and British air forces had been starved of funds until the mid-1930s and were caught in the middle of rapid expansion programs which were far from complete. Almost all the Luftwaffe's fighters were the Messerschmitt Bf 109, one of the most advanced and formidable fighting machines of the time. Almost 1,000 were already in service. It could only be rivaled by one Allied fighter, the British Supermarine Spitfire, and in spring 1940, less than 100 of these were available. The German Air Force also had 342 of the terrifying Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, which had been specifically designed for pinpoint attacks in support of a Blitzkrieg battle plan. The Allies had no comparable ground attack aircraft. In March 2003, the coalition also completely outnumbered and outclassed the Iraqi Air Force. The full might of the U.S. Air Force and Marine Corps and Navy aviation, with more than 3,000 ultra-modern fighters and fighter bombers, and 1,500 bombers and specialized ground attack aircraft, faced a handful of former Soviet fighters which had not received any spare parts for 10 years and were barely able to fly. The Iraqis did have some ex-Soviet anti-aircraft missile units and gun batteries. But 10 years of US and British aircraft imposing the United Nations no-fly zones had destroyed most of the radar systems on which these depended. On paper at least, control the air was the only Blitzkrieg requirement in which either the German battle planners of 1940 or the US battle planners of 2003 seemed to have a clear advantage. As far as being able to break through by achieving overwhelming force, both the Germans and the Americans seemed totally outnumbered. In both May 1940 and March 2003, appearances were deceptive. Next, the third vital requirement of Blitzkrieg: to break through by concentrating overwhelming force. Here, both teams of Blitzkrieg battle planners did have a clear advantage, but an advantage which was only clear after the event. In May 1940, not only were the Germans outnumbered in every other area than the air, but their tanks had thinner armor and less powerful guns than those of the Allies. The vast majority were light tanks, Panzer Mark I's originally intended for training and carrying only 2 machine guns, or Mark II's, designed as a reconnaissance vehicle armed with a 20mm cannon. Both should be easy meat for the many Allied tanks armed with 37mm and 40mm weapons, capable of slicing through their thin armor. The few medium tanks in the Panzer divisions, Mark III's with a 37mm gun and Mark IV's with a short-barreled 75, were also outclassed by many Allied tanks, particularly the mighty French Char B, which carried both a 47 and a 75mm gun. But the German battle planners were able to concentrate the majority of their crucial panzer divisions opposite the one sector of the front which the Allies thought hardly worth covering, the Ardennes. And these panzer divisions had been specially designed as fast-moving mechanized formations with a balance of tanks and motorized artillery and infantry, and trained to exploit an initial breakthrough ruthlessly. The German deception plan meant that the best Allied divisions had moved forward into Belgium, leaving the vital sector opposite the Ardennes defended by a few divisions of overage reservists. In the area where their battle plan required overwhelming force to break through the enemy line, the Germans had more than achieved it. In contrast, in March 2003, Tommy Franks never intended to achieve numerical superiority on the ground. 10 years earlier, in Operation Desert Storm, the Allies had fielded 750,000 men and over 2,000 tanks. As March 2003 began, the coalition had barely 120,000 men against the theoretical Iraqi strength of 375,000, and barely 500 tanks against 2,000. But Franks had learned a vital lesson from Operation Desert Storm. When the Allied attack in 1991 halted after liberating Kuwait and left Saddam still in power in Iraq, many commentators suggested that it was a political decision. Others disagree, laying the blame on one of the inherent weak spots in the Blitzkrieg battle plan: logistics.
The reason that the coalition attack stopped was quite simply logistics, that the tanks had run out of fuel and the air forces had run out of precision-guided munitions.
Whether the decision to stop during Desert Storm was due to politics or logistics, or a combination of both, an important lesson in armored warfare was learned by the U.S. battle planners.
Modern main battle tanks, tanks like the M1 and the Challenger, have such a voracious appetite for fuel that you can't use that many of them and still move quickly. The old marriage of armor and operational mobility that we saw during World War II has ended. And we now have to make trade-offs between combat power, the ability to fight, and operational mobility, the ability to move large distances over land.
To get around the logistic problem, Franks's version of the Blitzkrieg battle plan was based deliberately on using a far smaller force than in Desert Storm, but much more swiftly and aggressively. Yet the press and military pundits not only expressed concern that the number of coalition troops deployed for Iraqi freedom was much smaller than in Desert Storm, but that the weapons available in apparently far smaller numbers, looked much the same. The M1A Abrams tank, the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, the Paladin self-propelled gun. But what few laymen appreciated was the quantum leap in technological sophistication over the previous decade. GPS, the global positioning system, was now an integral part of most aerial weapon systems. During Desert Storm, only 10% of the weaponry had been precision guided, largely by laser designators. Now at least half was. And unmanned aerial vehicles and aerial command posts speeded up the gathering of information and its assessment and presentation to commanders. The US battle planners had also studied their much larger opponent. To an inexperienced eye, it still seemed a formidable force. But in reality, it was a pale shadow of even its 1992 strength. After studying intelligence reports on their opponent, Franks' planners are confident that their technological superiority will give them the overwhelming force that their plan requires. They note that there are few Iraqi units close to the Kuwait border, where their initial breakthrough will occur. The Iraqi battle plan seems to be to allow the Americans deep into their country and then try to bog them down. So the Blitzkrieg battle plan, which Franks and his team come up with, relies on unprecedented speed. The U.S. 3rd Mechanized Infantry Division, with 270 Abrams main battle tanks, will head up to the west of the Euphrates, moving as fast as possible and bypassing the major towns. Aiming at the gap around Karbala between the Euphrates and Lake Bar, less than 40 miles from Baghdad. From here, it will attack from the west. Behind it, a massive supply column will be guarded by units from the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions. These will also eliminate opposition left behind by the main thrust. The 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, the MEF, with 120 Abrams, will cross the Euphrates at the first possible place, Nasiriyah, which is also the first potential choke point. It will then advance in 2 columns, towards Diwaniyah and Kut, so as to keep the Iraqis guessing as to whether the other main thrust towards Baghdad will come from the south or east. Task Force Tarawa will follow up the MEF to guard its supply routes and eliminate opposition. The British will deal with Iraq's second city, Basra, in the south. The success of the battle plan depends on one crucial principle: reach Baghdad as fast as possible.
No successful military plan is ever made in a vacuum, and certainly Tommy Franks was a great student. He's a great student of military history, and he developed a plan that certainly the great military commanders in history would have understood: Hannibal, Julius Caesar, whomever. It was very much, therefore, a plan that Tommy Franks said was blitzkrieg with high-tech knobs on. The movement, the speed, the psychological impact was something that throughout history commanders had tried to achieve. Perhaps what they wouldn't have understood is the accuracy, the speed, the precision of everything that the commanders could do by 2003. But the basic plan was as old as time.
Now, the time has come for both breakthrough plans to be put to the test. For both the Germans and the coalition forces, the theoretical part of the battle planning is at an end. The reality of the breakthrough stage, the first direct contact with the enemy, is upon them. May 10th, 1940. The Germans execute their battle plan for Blitzkrieg. Army Group B thrusts into Holland and northern Belgium, luring the Allies forward. Further south, and almost unnoticed at first, the infantry, artillery, and combat engineers of Army Group A begin to punch through weak Allied forces, screening the Ardennes. Behind them come the panzers. Supported by Stukas, they get through the hills and woods of the Ardennes, cross the French border, and reach the River Meuse in just 3 days. Here, the French must stop them. It's the last natural defense line before the wide open plains of northern France, which reach all the way to the English Channel. But the Allied generals are focused on the threat further north. The low-grade troops defending the Meuse are given little support, and swiftly, the German assault engineers get across to establish 3 bridgeheads. Soon, the panzers are crossing. The Germans have achieved their breakthrough. They are now behind the main Allied armies with a virtually clear run all the way to the coast. March 20th, 2003. Coalition ground and air elements unleash their modern blitzkrieg. Airstrikes go into Baghdad. Apache helicopters cross the Kuwait-Iraq border to destroy Iraqi observation posts. Then artillery systems open up. By daybreak, the lead units of Frank's Blitzkrieg battle plan have crossed the Iraqi border and begun their race for Baghdad. The tanks of 3rd Infantry head northwest of the Euphrates. One brigade swings north to seize a crossing over the Euphrates west of Nasiriyah, the first potential choke point. The other 2 race north along dirt tracks and through the desert towards Samawa and Najaf, aiming for the Karbala Gap, the final choke point before Baghdad. The 1st Marine Division starts by striking north alongside the British 7th Armored Brigade towards the vital oil fields at Ramallah. These are swiftly captured, with only 7 out of 1,000 sabotaged. The Iraqi 51st Division collapses and surrenders. As anticipated, the breakthrough phase of the coalition Blitzkrieg battle plan is an immediate success. The few Iraqi forces anywhere near the border are swiftly brushed aside or disappear. The Marines then turn north towards the crossing point west of Nasiriyah, while the British continue on to capture Basra. Within the first few hours, the coalition forces have achieved what the Germans needed 3 days to accomplish: a breakthrough with wide open spaces ahead of them towards their main goal. For both armies, the next phase of the Blitzkrieg battle plan, strike deep, is crucial. It's now that they will be at their most vulnerable. France, May 1940. The Allied commanders seem utterly unable to understand what is happening to them. But they're not the only ones taken by surprise.
The Germans are also surprised by the initial success of their Blitzkrieg battle plan. But rather than either sitting on their laurels or trying to figure out what was going on, they simply pushed forward. They had this bias for action, this desire to push forward whenever they could. And so they decided to finish the job and then at leisure figure out what had gone wrong and what had gone right.
Once they were across the Meuse, the German panzer commanders, like Heinz Guderian, allowed nothing to stop them, not even Hitler. Within 8 more days, they had reached the coast of the English Channel, having traveled over 200 miles. With the panzers of Army Group A rampaging behind them, and German Army Group B pushing from the north, the Allies fall back, caught by a pincer movement, to Dunkirk. But the deep strike phase was not totally straightforward.
The Germans had trained a wild animal that they eventually let off the leash through the Ardennes in the spring of 1940. The difficulty was that the owner therefore lost control as soon as they let that dog off the leash. If you actually have a commander that is going to be bold, courageous and exploit opportunities, one day he's going to scare that owner. He's going to scare his headquarters.
So what did scare the owner? The first danger in the Blitzkrieg battle plan is that of counterattack. The longer and thinner the German line of advance became, the greater the exposure to counterattack, especially on weak flanks. In their drive west, the panzers came under 2 counterattacks, which might have changed the course of the battle. 3 days after the breakout from the Meuse bridgeheads, a French armored division attacked the dangerously exposed south flank. The attack was not properly supported and soon ground to a halt. But it so frightened Hitler and the German High Command that the panzer thrust was ordered to stop and wait for the infantry. The panzers did not stop.
Heinz Guderian wanted to move as quickly as possible, snapping at the backside of the retreating French and retreating British. Hitler, the owner back at headquarters, wanted to haul him back in, was calling him, was whistling for him, but he wasn't listening.
Then, 2 days later, near Arras, a British tank brigade tried to cut through the right flank. For a short time, it looked as if the right flank panzer division might be halted. But German artillery was rushed up, and this threw the British tanks back. The Germans raced on. March 24th, 2003, 3 days into the strike-deep phase of the U.S. Blitzkrieg battle plan, and Operation Iraqi Freedom is on target. The regular Iraqi army has been brushed aside and effectively disappears. The bridgehead west of Nasiriyah is seized. The 1st Marine Division has now arrived and is crossing, while the tanks of the 3rd Infantry have advanced more than 250 miles and isolated both Samawa and Najaf. Behind them, a convoy of 2,700 resupply vehicles, escorted by Apache helicopters of the 101st Airborne, has advanced almost 200 miles and established a FARP, a forward area refueling position for 3rd Infantry. And troops are leapfrogging by helicopter to establish FARPs even further on.
As you know, our forces have been moving rapidly. We've intentionally bypassed enemy formations to include paramilitary and the Fedayeen.
But Tommy Franks has put his finger on the fact that his deep-striking forces are just as vulnerable as the Germans were in 1940. March 24th, 2003. At Nasiriyah, already identified as a choke point, the Marines move in to seize more bridges in the town. They intend to roll around potential strongpoints. But the lead units take a wrong turn and become involved in confused fighting with the Fedayeen and Ba'ath Party fanatics. The Marines are forced to go down what they term Ambush Alley and lose several vehicles. Eventually, the bridges are seized for the Marines to cross. But it takes the follow-up troops of Task Force Tarawa more than a week to secure the town so that supply columns can use the bridges unhindered.
I don't think anyone came into here thinking it was going to be a cakewalk. We knew that there were cells like the Republican Guard. We just didn't know when we'd run into them.
Elsewhere on the long road to Baghdad, Operation Iraqi Freedom could not avoid the other inherent problem of lightning war: logistics. The coalition supply columns snake north in seemingly unending lines. The attack units in front of them are armored. The supply vehicles are soft-skinned, therefore vulnerable.
The Iraqis could have exploited this by using what might be called the Savage Rabbit defense. If the Iraqi forces had waited for the coalition forces to bypass them and then emerge from their holes, as it were, to attack the supply units, the maintenance units, the logistics units, then they could have inflicted quite a bit of damage and forced the coalition forces to stop, maybe even turn around.
The Fedayeen and other paramilitaries do launch sporadic attacks on the supply columns, but it is never a consistent plan.
Certainly there have been some harassing attacks on our supply lines, and they continue. But they have not stopped the movement of our logistics support forward to each of our fielded forces. We continue to provide self-protection to those. What we note is those attacks have become fewer with fewer forces, and they have all been defeated with relatively minimal cost to our forces.
But in the fog of war, with troops exhausted, accidents happen. Near Nasiriyah, one resupply unit becomes lost and ends up in a firefight, with some of its members killed and others captured, including Private Jessica Lynch. The logistics problem also caught up with the German battle plan in World War II. On May 25th, 2 weeks after the launch of their Blitzkrieg, they had the British and French armies trapped at Dunkirk. The tanks might have swept on and taken the trapped men, but they stopped, and over 350,000 British and French troops were able to escape from the beaches.
Interestingly, historically, it seems to be that around the 250-mile mark, armies tend to run out of steam. If you measure the distance from the start point of the German attack through the Ardennes, through the route that they took to the Dunkirk perimeter, it works out at very roughly 250 miles.
The German advance was so fast that it outran its backup. This was largely because, despite propaganda film of tanks and trucks, more than 90% of the German army was still reliant on its foot soldiers and horses. Over 60 years later, on March 25th, the U.S. commanders, like their German counterparts, decide that a halt must be made to regroup before completing their campaign with the assault on Baghdad. As they do so, another sort of fog of war strikes their advance, the Shamal, blinding sandstorms. Frank's 3rd Division halts. The lighter armored Marines stop their advance, so as not to get too far ahead. The decision is misinterpreted by many journalists. The media assumes that the advance has stalled and that the American military face another Vietnam. In fact, the Americans are resting and, more importantly, resupplying.
To the uninitiated, some of the things that happened during Iraqi freedom looked as though Blitzkrieg was failing, but to those that understood the history of Blitzkrieg, these were common problems that the Americans were trying to overcome.
Then, on April 2nd, the race to Baghdad is unleashed again. West of the Euphrates, Apache gunships of the 101st Airborne attacked the Iraqi Republican Guard Medina Division near Karbala. U.S. Rangers seized the Hadathan Dam on the outskirts of Karbala to stop the Iraqis blowing it and flooding the area. U.S. 3rd Infantry pushes around the city, seizes the main bridge on the road to Baghdad, and begins to probe towards the capital. East of the Euphrates, one Marine column reaches Diwaniyah, but instead of continuing direct towards Baghdad, swings northeast to cross the Tigris west of Kut. This bypasses the city, which the Iraqis had been preparing to defend. The Marines then head for Baghdad. On April 3rd, an armored company from 3rd Infantry Division reaches and takes Baghdad Airport. The expected resistance does not take place. But the interlude is deceptive, the result of the speed of the American advance. Not expecting the enemy so quickly, the defenders have gone underground to sleep. When they wake up, a fierce counterattack takes place, and fighting for the airport rages for more than 24 hours. The Marines approaching from the east also encounter more determined resistance. But by April 6th, they too are pushing into the city. It takes 2 more days for U.S. forces to close off Baghdad completely. Then, a Marine engineer team helps excited Iraqi civilians pull down the statue of Saddam Hussein in Firdos Square. But the capture of Baghdad airport had effectively marked the end of the battle plan for Blitzkrieg in Iraq, just as the halt at Dunkirk had marked the end of the German Blitzkrieg in northern France. Both armies, over 60 years apart, had shown how Blitzkrieg could be a triumphant success. But if one looks at how they each stacked up, both against the requirements of the Blitzkrieg battle plan and its weaknesses, there are interesting similarities and contrasts. Both commanders deceived the enemy and controlled the air. In the breakthrough and strike deep phases of the battle plan, the relative technological balance between each side and its enemy played a crucial role. Except in the air, the Germans had no particular advantage in numbers or equipment. They achieved overwhelming force where it was needed by grouping their panzer divisions together and then using them ruthlessly. In contrast, the Americans used the enormous technological superiority of their weapons and communications to overwhelm an enemy which theoretically greatly outnumbered them. But there were cautionary final notes which showed that even a high-tech Blitzkrieg is exposed to the same inherent problems that the Germans encountered in 1940. The Germans faced 2 attempted counterattacks, but both were poorly coordinated and ineffective. The psychological power of their Blitzkrieg had stunned their enemy. The American combat units had little problem with the regular Iraqi army, or even the Republican Guard. Their problems came further back. The skill of the American logistics units helped to sustain the extraordinarily rapid advance, but only up to the same sort of 250-mile distance that the Germans had achieved. Then, even with trucks and helicopters, rather than feet and horses, a halt became inevitable. And for the Americans, this long logistics train turned out to be particularly vulnerable to guerrilla action by relatively unsophisticated enemy troops. It was a different form of counterattack, which could have given them considerable problems had the Iraqis used it more consistently. The major problems that the coalition would later face, the follow-up phase of Blitzkrieg, came only after the amazing success of the Blitzkrieg battle plan. But this only emphasizes another lesson that the Germans had learned over 60 years before, that ultimately, a mass army is needed on the ground to secure it after the first rapid victories. For the long-term future, there was a new factor.
The lesson of Operation Iraqi Freedom, I think, is that you can either have a large force that moves slowly or a small force that moves quickly, but you can't have a large force that moves rapidly. That I think we'll see in the future a great deal of use of the Blitzkrieg battle plan, but on a smaller scale. That it's unlikely that we will see a repetition of the large-scale Blitzkrieg attacks of the Second World War, or even of Desert Storm, until someone solves the problem of large battle tanks that require 6 gallons of fuel for every mile that they travel.
The wheel has come full circle in the battle plan for Blitzkrieg. Once again, the way commanders fight this fast-moving, hard-hitting type of warfare is being limited by the capability of the technology available. Blitzkrieg awaits its next revolution.